Hello everyone. In this video, we're continuing to examine theology surrounding God's temple, specifically the designation of the temple as the house of God or the Father's house, which especially helps us understand John 2 and 14. So here we go. You might be surprised to learn that despite the importance of temple theology in the Old Testament, no word for temple exists in the Hebrew language. When referring to the temple, biblical authors most often use the word bayit, house, or hekal, palace. As the terms imply, an ancient temple was the residence of a god. Whereas modern churches serve the needs of the faith community, temples existed to serve the divine resident. And though the temple was the locus of God's presence on earth, his primary dwelling place remained in the heavenly temple. So the earthly temple functioned as both a parallel residence and a gate through which God's presence could move throughout the earth. So even prior to Christ, the presence of God wasn't restricted to a certain place. He was simply more fully in one place, the temple. The concept is easy to grasp when one views the temple as the house of God, which is the most common name for the temple in the Old Testament and other Jewish literature. Just as you and I reside in our homes, but come and go as needed, God resided in his temple, but was not confined to it. Also, like a house or palace, the temple was a complex of rooms and chambers. And although the focal point of the space was the sanctuary, the precincts also held quarters for lodging, cooking, and storage, in addition to spaces for priestly ritual and the courtyards for worship. Along such lines, the temple scroll from Qumran anticipates that a future temple will be built with chambers for every tribe of Israel. Stephen Bryan explains that in this perfected future temple, quote, the people of God enjoy unprecedented access to the presence of God in rooms that have been prepared for them, end quote. Remind you of anything? John 14 maybe? Now, the house of God can certainly refer to the temple, but it can also refer to the kingdom of God, more specifically, the people of God. For example, house is often used in a familial or communal sense to refer to the household of a patriarch like Abraham, Israel, or Judah. So the notion that the house of God could refer to the people of God began to develop long before Christ. The associations of kingdom and community are carried forward into the New Testament as spatial and genealogical bonds are increasingly replaced by relational and spiritual ones. In Ephesians 2:19, Paul tells the Ephesian church that they are members of God's household, growing into a holy temple. The movement away from conceiving of the temple as the locus of God's presence was not a shocking development in the scope of Jewish history. Even as far back as the exilic period, centuries before Christ, the Jewish people had learned to define their relationship with God outside of land and temple. After the first temple had been destroyed and the people were exiled, both Jeremiah and Ezekiel encouraged a movement toward personal holiness in the absence of temple and priestly institutions. A humble spirit and obedient heart had long been essential aspects of experiencing God's presence, whether in the temple or away from it. Nonetheless, the Jewish people never abandoned their hope of a restored future temple. And a second temple was indeed rebuilt during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, around 515 BC, and refurbished during the reign of Herod, around 20 BC. At the same time, many Jewish people continued to anticipate a perfected eschatological temple that would usher in the Messianic age. Yet even as they worshipped in the Jerusalem temple and hoped for an eschatological one, the Jewish sages continued to affirm that intimacy with God was available to his people through the medium of Torah and wisdom. When Herod's temple was destroyed by Rome in 70 CE, just prior to the composition of John's Gospel, the Jewish people were in dire straits as they sought to articulate how they would relate to God without the focal point of their faith. Just as the Jewish people were beginning the process of redefining themselves, so were Christians defining and refining their own identity. Both groups sought to understand the actions of God in recent history. With the destruction of the temple, the Jewish people turned to Torah to replace what they had lost, while John reveals Jesus to be the new temple and the truth to which it had always pointed. Understanding Jesus as a new locus of sacred space is fundamental for understanding the entirety of the fourth gospel. Sacred spaces throughout the history of Israel, most notably the temple and tabernacle, had all pointed toward the role and identity of Christ. The author of the fourth gospel thus offers an overt and sustained presentation of Jesus as the replacement for such holy places. Mary Colo, a lovely Australian scholar who so graciously endorsed my book, explains, quote, "The intimate union of Father and Son in the person of Jesus creates a new sacred place that does away with regional sanctuaries and provides a new mode of worship of the Father in spirit and truth." Now, this info has implications for the entirety of John's Gospel, but especially the opening verses of chapter 14. As you read, strive to lay aside any preconceived notions and allow this historical and theological background to inform your understanding. We'll talk more about sacred space soon.